Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID. Today, my guest is Janene Yazzie from New Mexico, who works with the, well, you tell us where you work, Janene.
Yes, it is a mouthful. I'm a community organizer and human rights advocate, and I've had the pleasure of working with International Indian Treaty Council as their Sustainable Development Program Coordinator and as their representative as co-convenor of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, which engages with the UN High-Level Political Forum on the SDGs.
Right. And I mean, what I'd really like to get some understanding from you is there are many reports in the newspapers about the exceptionally high rate of infections and mortality amongst the Diné Nation, the nation who the Spanish call the Navajo. Could you help us to understand what's going on? Why is this happening?
Yes, absolutely. I was part of a group as a community organizer who's been working on environmental justice issues, addressing the legacy of environmental contamination in our territories. We're paying particularly close attention to this pandemic when it was arising and mostly coming out of Europe. And with that work, began to mobilize relief structure almost immediately because we were anticipating the unique vulnerabilities of our communities, just paying attention to the research at the time and knowing that this virus was disproportionately impacting people with certain pre-existing conditions. It really raised the alarm for us early on, knowing that we have a large population with pre-existing conditions due to the cumulative impact of environmental contamination in our territories, but also realizing that the best health and safety protocols that emerged early on in our understanding of this virus would be made impossible for many families who didn't have access to clean drinking water, to running water and sanitation facilities, and other critical community infrastructure such as energy and broadband. And so a lot of the social distancing requirements, a lot of the hygiene requirements, and a lot of the self-isolation protocols that are very important for stopping and stemming community spread were going to be enormously difficult for our communities to deal with. And with that foresight, we began to organize. But I think the rest of the world started to discover with us as this virus spread that even though the virus itself is indiscriminate, that long-standing systemic inequalities and systemic oppression of vulnerable communities was causing this virus to have a bigger and deeper impact on vulnerable groups. And that was also true for my nation, the Navajo Nation.
So when you're saying that the underlying conditions, most people talk about underlying health conditions, but we're talking really about underlying wealth conditions. We're talking about massive impoverishment. Help me understand that many people will not have visited, not have had an opportunity to visit where the Diné Nation live. So help me describe the conditions people are living under.
There's a whole complex history that I'm going to try to summarize and do justice towards in this, because it's vitally important to really understand the situation that our communities found ourselves in at the beginning of this health crisis. We're fortunate to not only still retain a large portion of our traditional ancestral territories, but to also, until the recent Supreme Court decision, have been the largest contiguous land-based tribe in the United States. And with that, win, which was over several generations of hard-fought battles to restore our claim over our ancestral territories, comes a whole complicated history around jurisdictional authority, jurisdictional law, and the way that we have been allowed, quote unquote, to build and use our lands and territories and resources. And so as a result, what's really important is that one of the questions we kept getting from journalists as, the national spotlight was aimed towards our nation due to the high rate of cases and the per capita rate of people impacted by this virus was like, why do you not have drinking water? Why do such a large percentage of your population lack access to these basic human rights? And the short answer is that this is manufactured poverty. This is a manufactured systemic oppression built to create our dependency on the federal government for life-saving resources, despite having a treaty that grants us these rights to healthcare, to education, and to basic human rights resources like access to clean drinking water. And so the legacy of that, and why I say this is manufactured, is that the legal and political infrastructure works hand in hand to ensure that our people don't have self-sufficiency, to ensure that we cannot enact a version of sovereignty that threatens the corporate capitalist monopolization of our coal, our uranium, and our natural gas resources. And so when you have poor communities, when you inhibit economic development, when you inhibit the building of critical community infrastructure that can get water and energy to every household, you create a population that is vulnerable and that is easily exploited to support mining industries and extractive industries that otherwise come into conflict with our cultural values and our traditional life ways that teach us to be stewards of our environment and to not build wealth over the exploitation and the pollution of our environment. And so that legacy of colonization and this manufactured economic dependency has created the situation where we don't have paved roads to most of our communities, where we don't have access to clean drinking water, to broadband, to energy, and where most of our population is living in overcrowded conditions despite being in very rural communities. And so once this virus came into our communities, the fact that we are the size of West Virginia and we only have 8 Indian healthcare services serving our entire nation. The minute the first case popped up in a very rural community, you're talking about a pathway of exposure just to receive healthcare that is 50 to 60 miles away. And then when this virus first came to our communities, the federal government completely lapsed in its responsibility to prepare our communities for this. So our healthcare facilities didn't even have the capacity to test these initial cases. So not only did those families have to go from their rural community 40, 50 miles away to the nearest hospital, they then had to be transported 4 hours away to Phoenix, Arizona, in order to actually receive the tests needed to confirm that they were indeed COVID positive. And so we all knew, living here and knowing these challenges, knowing these barriers to healthcare, that we were going to see along that pathway the emergence of a hotspot, and that's exactly what happened. And so compounding that with the lack of information about this pandemic in a language in our traditional language, so that we could best communicate and prepare, especially our most vulnerable groups, which are our elders and people living without access to radio, to cell phone service, to internet, really created an informational gap that just exacerbated these pre-existing conditions that were already setting up these enormous challenges for people to be able to prepare to respond and to protect themselves from the spread of this virus.
What you're describing is a profound level of racism that exists against not just the Diné Nation, but the other nations across the Americas. But people don't talk about this as racism. There's a lot of descriptions and talk nowadays because of the killing recently of several people, including George Floyd, about anti-Black racism. But is there not also a long and historic racism that affects the indigenous populations of this continent?
Absolutely. And I feel like that's been the power of the dominant narrative about how to enact and nurture change in a so-called democratic society, is that we are forced to silo our issues, and we are forced to look at and address only one issue at a time, ignoring the intersectionality and the very fact that this country and these unjust institutions of power were built off simultaneously the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of black African Americans. And like this worked hand in hand as part of the colonial project to build what we've inherited in our political and economic systems. And so it's very important to address those histories as a whole. And you know, our communities, even while we were gripped with the most horrible impacts of this pandemic, still showed up in support and still showed up to organize marches in support of our Black Lives Matter relatives who are fighting against the systemic oppression and the use of violence in the police state to continue to criminalize Black and brown bodies. And we did so with the consciousness that our struggles are connected. They're inextricably so, and that we also suffer at the hand of this oppressive police state and state-sanctioned police violence, and what has resulted from the militarization of our police and the threat that has had against our fight for protection of our land, territories, and resources as Indigenous peoples. So it was not lost on us that we should be equally outraged at the prevalence and the consistency of the murder of Black people, our Black relatives, by police, and the way that these murderers are able to get away with it because they have a job description and a badge that signifies their role in protecting and maintaining the state. And so the solidarity that has been shown between our groups, it was the same solidarity that we saw at Standing Rock as our Lakota brothers and sisters were fighting to protect their clean drinking water from the development of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Black Lives Matter movement groups also showed up there to stand in solidarity with us. And I think that is what is the biggest threat to those who hold power, is that type of solidarity, that type of allyship that is rooted in a deep conscious analysis of how these systems of power have been able to build and maintain themselves for generations, and how they must be stopped, they must be dismantled, and we must ally ourselves together, partner together in the building of shared solutions. And I think that you know, this pandemic and everything that it's brought to us has also really awakened a large amount of people to the reality that we don't have any more time to be placated by false solutions, and that now is the moment for us to stand up together to create the real solutions, the real social nets, the real political and economic systems that actually help us achieve the goal of equality for all and sustainability for all of life.
So you're facing this long history of racism. You're facing, as I understand it, many areas, water that's contaminated with uranium, with arsenic, and so on. Access to water is very limited. There's poor health facilities, and I presume poor education facilities. there's very, very little infrastructure. And now, on top of that, we have the COVID-19 virus affecting this community. So, what does it mean to organize now in your conditions? What does it mean to organize in the time of COVID?
It's very difficult, especially since the majority of the world has shifted their work streams to use virtual platforms such as Zoom, GoToMeeting, all of these great applications and tools that have been created. But when we have a digital divide that is constructed along the same lines of the systemic inequity that we see with access to water and access to energy, that really limits us in our ability to participate in decision-making processes, our ability to mobilize, so that people who have taken to the streets to protest police brutality, to advocate for more change, systemic change, are having to make that decision about putting themselves at risk for contracting this virus. And for a lot of people, it's been worth it, because we cannot allow those that are blind to this history, that are blind to these realities, to continue to promote the reopening of the economy for the benefit of the nation, to the detriment of the families and the vulnerable groups and the marginalized groups that have been and are going to continue to be most impacted by this health crisis. And so I think it's a real watershed moment. It's an exciting time to be alive, as stressful as it is, and as much grief as we're carrying in the midst of this pandemic, having lost so many loved ones, so many allies, and so many community organizers that were vital to this movement from this pandemic. I think it's also really planted the seed for just outright resilience and outright hope that it's now or never, that we cannot return to normal, that this pandemic is a wake-up call that is shifting the way we look at and understand power, the way we understand equity, the way we prioritize what we want to invest in for the protection of everyone, if you're paying attention. And I think that's a call to the front lines that resonates with everyone, and that will continue to resonate with everyone as we have these discussions and see what's happening across the United States, in these states that have, different approaches for how to reopen up their economies and the impact that has had on their populations. And so, it's been extremely difficult to organize in this moment, but it hasn't been impossible. And I think that shows both the dedication and the commitment to social justice and equity, and the power of people to, even in the midst of this and all of the challenges that it's created, all of the fear and the sense of loss that we're living with now, that we still have the ability and the responsibility to step up and to continue to build the movement that is necessary to actualize justice for us and for future generations, so that we don't return to the status quo that got us all here in this place in the first place.
There's a very interesting article that appeared about a week ago in the Scientific American by Sunny Dooley. And the headline I thought was really interesting. One was, of course, that the coronavirus is attacking your nation. And he argues, because we have built the perfect human for it to invade. Help me understand, what does it mean to be a perfect human?
I did not read this article, but I do know and respect Sunny Dooley very much. I did see it come across my feed a couple of times. So I'm just going to have to make some speculations over what she meant. But from my understanding and the subtitle, basically what I was talking about earlier, just like the generations of environmental contamination, all of the systemic oppression that has happened in our communities, creating all these preconditions, both in public health crises and in lack of critical community infrastructure, and even the way that it's impacted our education and our access to science-based materials and education, I think has created the perfect conditions for this virus to spread and disproportionately impact our peoples for the benefit benefit of the colonial project, which is structured to continue the removal, the disappearance, and the marginalization of Indigenous peoples, so that it can free up access to our lands, territories, and resources. That's just my assumption about the direction that article probably ended up taking.
Yeah. I mean, a friend of mine talks about the indigenous people of the Americas being what she describes as the post-apocalyptic generations, that we should be listening to the experiences of these people, because we are entering into a period where huge climate crisis and pandemic crisis, not just one, but possibly many more to come. And it is the indigenous people of this continent who have the experience of what it means to survive that. What's your comment on that perspective?
Yes, prior to this pandemic, before people could realize it, we're trying to bring attention to the issue of climate change and the wake-up call that already should have been about our unsustainable lifestyle and our unjust systems of power. And we've used that. Several Indigenous scholars have very beautifully and poetically laid out the argument for why we have a wisdom that is rooted in resilience and survivance, based off of our experience of living through many apocalypses, not just the apocalypse of colonization and the different waves of colonization that we've had to endure, but even in our oral histories, we have lived through the ending of our world several different times, and each time it was something different. And so I think that with this, and just with what we've seen with the mobilization of grassroots relief efforts, that in itself has been testament to the fact that we are our own solutions, that if we value community, if we value collective survival and ensuring and securing a quality of life that is available to all, especially our most marginalized within our communities, then we can awaken the collective capacity to get through even this pandemic. And we've shown that in the midst of federal government failures and just confusion and the lack of a coordinated response that was proactive and effective in stemming community spread of this virus, that our own people stepping up to the plate to share our expertise, to bring our knowledge systems and our skills and our traditional knowledge around medicine, around food systems, and around taking care of each other as relatives, has shown that we have within us the solutions that are necessary to deal with the inefficiencies and the inability of these political and economic structures to support us as a human community. And I'll continue to stand by that and continue to do what I can to promote how Indigenous peoples have always championed solutions that are holistic, that are comprehensive, and that are rooted in a completely alternative worldview that can show us a different pathway away from corporate capitalism, away from Western patriarchy influences and values that these current systems are rooted in. And we really do need those alternatives in order to imagine a different and better future for future generations.
Yeah, you've talked about the solidarity that you've shown to the struggles at Black Lives Matter, the big uprisings that are happening across across the United States, certainly. What solidarity are you looking for from not just the Black Lives Matter movement, but other movements and other people around North America? What are your expectations for, as somebody describes solidarity as being what love looks like on the streets? Well, how would you see that solidarity being expressed?
Ideally, solidarity would be built on our intersectionality and a deep critical analysis of colonization, of settler colonialism, of white heteronormative patriarchy and white supremacy, and how this has invaded almost every single institution that we have come to participate in, and how in that process and over generations of this assimilation and this like indoctrination into these structures, that we ourselves have become conditioned to these values. And so solidarity is a two-way thing. It's standing together with each other on shared goals and shared principles, but it's also doing that inner work within ourselves and within our movements to recognize, name, and dismantle these influences in our organizing practices and the way we look at and define our shared goals, so that we can really be committed to alternatives that do not replicate these cycles of violence and these systems of oppression that everyone deserves to be liberated from.
Wow, that's quite a message. Any final thoughts you'd like to convey to people who've been watching and will be watching this video?
Do not lose hope. Do not lose hope. And I have to say that to myself as well, to remind myself in the midst of what my nation is still going through and what our friends and allies are going through and every part of this globe, that, you know, we have to continue to believe that enough of us are going to wake up in this moment and recognize what a privilege it is to be alive in an extraordinary period of transition with these extraordinary challenges that we face. We also have the tools that we need to overcome these challenges and to build better and more just futures for all of our peoples. And we have that obligation. We have that obligation to our ancestors who have overcome similar challenges, who have overcome similarly difficult times. And we have that obligation to our future generations who are depending on us right now to make the right movements, to make the right choices that may not benefit us immediately, may not even be enough to manifest any real change in our lifetimes. But that's not the point. The point is to do everything we can with the resources that we have available to us, with the faculties we have available to us, so that we can change the direction of our entire human community and build something better so that our future generations can inherit what they really deserve.
I'm always impressed when I talk to representatives of nations such as yours, that in spite of all the terror and terrorism, state terrorism that you have faced, you appeal for justice for everyone, not just for yourselves, that it is a universalist aspiration. And I think that's something, going back to my earlier question, is something that we all need to learn from. So I really appreciate the way that you've expressed this. And thank you very much for joining us on organizing in the time of COVID. I hope we will be able to keep in touch and join in the struggle for a better world.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
It's been great. Thank you. You look after yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Take care.
Yes.
That was Janene Yazzie speaking about the struggle of the Dine people, the so-called Navajo Nation. This is Feroz Manji from Daraja Press signing off from today. And thank you for joining us here on Organizing in the Time of COVID. Wish you well and look after yourselves.